Jake Nabel is the Getty Villa postdoctoral scholar coming from Cornell University with a dissertation entitled The Arsacids of Rome, Royal Hostages and Roman-Parthian Relations in the First Century CE. He defended this dissertation April 13th, 2016. His research interests include Roman history of the late Republic and early Principate, and interactions between the classical Mediterranean and ancient Persia. He is also the principal investigator of Parthian sources online, so everyone can now type in www.parthiansources.com, a digital collection of texts from the Parthian Empire in Parthian, Greek, and Latin. He will be presenting on Greek deportees, Persian empires, and the classical Mediterranean.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Cooney, for that introduction. And I want to thank also the organizers, both from the Portavood Center and the Getty Research Institute as well. It's a great pleasure to participate today. So to begin, in 490 BCE and then again in 480, the Achaemenid Persian Empire invaded mainland Greece. Under the leadership of Athens and Sparta, the Greeks were mostly successful in repulsing these campaigns, and the memory of the Greco-Persian Wars would subsequently become a key part of how the Greeks thought about the difference between Hellenism on their side and Eastern barbarism on the other, at least that is in the overwhelmingly Athenian sources that survive for study today. Some 500 years later, however, another empire would claim the mantle of the classical Greeks in its own struggles against the Persian empires to its east, and that empire was Rome. From the 1st century BCE through the 7th CE, Rome faced two imperial peers and rivals on the Iranian plateau. First, the empire of the Arsacid Parthians, and later that of the Sasanians. In their conflicts with these empires, the Romans looked back on the Greco-Persian Wars of the 5th century BCE to explain the present by means of a historical analogy. Just as the Parthians and the Sasanians were the heirs to the legacy of the Achaemenids, so the Romans were the heirs to the classical Greeks. This Roman use of the Persian Wars tradition has been explored in important studies by Anthony Spawforth, Rolf Schneider, Charlotte LaRouche Cohen, and Rahim Shayagan. Discussion has revolved largely around Roman reenactments of the Battle of Salamis, the pivotal naval engagement in 480 BCE, where a Greek fleet under Athenian leadership defeated the Persian navy. Most famously, the Roman Emperor Augustus restaged the Battle of Salamis on the Tiber River in the year 2 BCE, an event that's depicted here in an 1894 painting by Ulpiano Cecca. And I do just want to mention really quickly, especially at a conference on Persia in the West, that this is not a matter of antiquarian interest. When in 2014, this movie, 300 Rise of an Empire, came out, our society, in effect, entered into a 2,000-year-old tradition that was begun by the Emperor Augustus of reenacting the Battle of Salamis as a marker of civilizational identity. And the xenophobic and Orientalist tropes that this movie relies upon have a very long pedigree. And as I think the movie shows, not only are we not free of this conceptual baggage, in many ways we are still routinely adding to it as well. But neither Salamis nor the Roman memory of it is my focus today. Instead, I want to focus on a different aspect of Rome's Persian Wars tradition that's received less attention in previous scholarship, namely the discourse in Roman sources about the Achaemenid deportation of Greek populations from the Aegean to the Persian interior. My vehicle for this is a passage in Philostratus, a Greek who lived in the Roman Empire and wrote in the 3rd century CE. The episode in question comes from Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana, a biography of a 1st century CE Pythagorean sage who traveled through Persia on a long journey to commune with Indian philosophers. Not long after the commencement of his journey, Apollonius makes a remarkable discovery. He comes across a community of Greeks from the city of Eretria on mainland Greece who had been deported to Mesopotamia during the campaign of the Achaemenid king Darius I in 490 BCE, some 5 centuries before Apollonius' own day and 7 before the career of Philostratus. So to be clear here, I'm focusing on a passage that is written by a 3rd century CE author, writing a biography of a 1st century CE Greek philosopher who supposedly comes across a Greek population deported in the 5th century BCE. So this is a very long time scale that gives you a sense of just how long some of these events reverberated. My goal in my paper is to show how Philostratus' narrative of these Greek deportees presents Roman-Persian interaction in his own day as a continuation of a civilizational struggle that began during the Greco-Persian Wars. Apollonius's imagined rediscovery of forcibly resettled Eretrian Greeks deep within the Achaemenid Empire furnished his biographer with a way of elaborating a distinction between the Greco-Roman and Persian worlds by showing the consequences of forcing Greeks to live where they fundamentally did not belong. So strikingly, the act of reflecting on deportations between these two worlds seems to have been one way of drawing the fault lines between them. In what follows, I'll try to establish something of the reality of these deportations, as well as the rhetoric that surrounded them, both in Greco-Roman and in Persian sources. Let me start by laying out the passage that, in my view, is really at the heart of Philostratus' Eretrian narrative. The background is this. Philostratus' hero, the sage Apollonius, has crossed the Euphrates, the symbolic border between Rome and Parthia in the 1st century CE, and he's crossing Persia on his way to India. One night in Mesopotamia, he has a dream, which he explains to his traveling companion on the following day with these words, and I'll read these if it's a little small for those in the back. Fish that had been cast out of the sea, he says to his companion, were gasping on land, emitting the laments of human beings and complaining at their removal from their element. They were begging a dolphin who was swimming along the shore to help them in their piteous state, as though they were people crying out in a foreign land. So Apollonius interprets this dream in very short order, and his explanation to his companion is as follows. I'll explain, he says, what the dream portends. A group of Eretrians inhabit this land of Kysia. They were transported here once by Darius, 500 years ago. They're said to have suffered the fate of fish in their capture, for they were surrounded by a dragnet and all of them were taken. So on this reading, the Eretrians are the fish out of water, and Apollonius himself is the dolphin who's been sent to help them. Now first, the story of the Eretrians does have a historical basis. Our most important source for it is the 5th century BCE Greek historian Herodotus, who actually records several such Achaemenid deportations of Greek populations. So Herodotus writes that the Achaemenid king Darius decided to forcibly resettle the Eretrians and the Athenians as well, for aiding the unsuccessful revolt of the Ionian Greeks against Persia from 499 to 493 BCE. Now, the Athenians are able to avoid the fate of deportation by famously winning the Battle of Marathon in 490. The Eretrians are unsuccessful, however, in their resistance, so they are all rounded up and transported to the east en masse. Herodotus isn't particularly clear about the numbers involved. One scholar of ancient demography puts the population of Eretria in this period at 23,000. It seems unlikely that the relocation was quite so large because later on, even in Herodotus' account, Eretria reemerges as a functioning city. But he certainly gives an indication that a number of people, a number of citizens were taken. Evidence from both Herodotus and indigenous Persian sources suggest that the Eretrians were transported and resettled as a population group. So first, Herodotus says that Darius resettled the Eretrians as a community in Arderica, a royal landholding in southern Mesopotamia. We don't know the precise location of this city, but it was about 20 miles away from the Achaemenid capital of Susa, and I've marked its approximate location on the map here. No evidence from Persian territory specifically documents the fate of the Eretrians or refers explicitly to Achaemenid interaction with this city. But we do have some indigenous evidence that can inform us about the conditions that these deportees are likely to have lived under. The most important documents come from the Persepolis fortification tablets, a relatively large archive by ancient standards anyway, of between 15 to 18,000 distinct documents that date between 509 and 493 BCE. The documents are mostly in Elamite, as we've heard, but a substantial minority are in Aramaic and some are in still other languages as well. And I should stress that work on these is ongoing. About 2,000 have been published with translations, 5,000 or so have been edited, but many thousands still remain untouched and unstudied. For the present purposes, these tablets are important because they're really quite good evidence for the presence of foreign population groups in the Achaemenid heartlands, including Greeks. Wouter Henkelmann and Matthew Stolper's study of 5,000 texts turned up 7 tablets that collectively account for 1,142 Greeks living in the neighborhood of Persepolis. And there are many other foreign groups attested. Compare, for instance, 4,046 Lycians from Asia Minor, or from the other end of the Achaemenid Empire, 400 Indians. Now, to be clear, no tablets refer unambiguously to deportees or to Greek populations that we know from literary evidence to have been resettled. Mostly they refer to groups of workers, known as Kurdash in Elamite. Now, some scholars think that the ranks of the Kurdash would have included deportees. Others argue that they were something more akin to temporary conscripts or corvée laborers. That problem will not be resolved here, but I think it can at least be said that the tablets shed some light on foreign populations, drawn in some cases from very, very remote regions, that are living in the heartland of the Iranian plateau, and their presence there is likely, very likely, to have been a matter of coercion. So here are a couple of the tablets that attest the presence of Greeks at Persepolis and what they can tell us about the conditions under which these people lived. So first, this tablet, which dates to 506 BCE, we can see that a group of over 1,100 Greek workers was living in a nearby village, close to Persepolis, that is, and receiving a ration of fruit. The document accounts for men, but it also mentions boys and girls. This seems to suggest that the Persian administration had a stake not only in the subsistence of these foreign laborers, but also in their reproduction. That impression is confirmed in another tablet here that's dated to 499 BCE. Here we're dealing with a smaller group of Greek women. The tablet shows that these women have just given birth and that their reproduction has been encouraged and managed by their Persian overseers through the awarding of extra rations. And you can see that the mothers of boys get a little bit more in terms of extra rations than the mothers of girls. It would seem then that the Persians wanted their workforce to be demographically sustainable, and they dealt with the issue by supporting and rewarding motherhood on an administrative level. So were these Greeks living as communities of Greeks, or did their identities just sort of fade into obscurity amidst the multi-ethnic milieu at Persepolis? The rather limited information in our Persian archival sources leaves a lot of questions open here, but I think the 2 documents we just saw do support the idea that the Greeks were living as distinct populations. First, we have the fact that they are labeled as such in the tablets, which treat them as groups and very, very rarely deal with multiple ethnicities in a single document. So the receipts tend to separate Greeks from Egyptians, for instance, Egyptians from Bactrians, and so on. We also know from other texts in the archive that different officials in the Persian administration tended to handle different ethnic groups. Second, the reproduction of these groups was state-supported, as we see in this tablet, and the children of these laborers seem to have been fed and housed with them, as we saw in the first one. That sounds like a recipe for defined communities, even if the evidence doesn't really allow us to trace the shape of these communities over time. Here, I want to return to Philostratus' Eretrians to see how his representation of their Mesopotamian settlement corresponds with the contemporary Persian evidence. As we saw earlier, Philostratus' subject Apollonius determined that he'd been sent to help this group of deported Eretrians, or at least their descendants, whom he considered Greek fish out of water on Persia's dry land. Philostratus does just about everything he can in his narrative to create the impression that this population is both out of place in the landscape of Mesopotamia and regarded with hostility by its indigenous neighbors. So of their settlement, he writes the following, and this is Philostratus. The land that the Eretrians inhabit is in the middle of the region of Kistia, and it's surrounded by a river channel, which they themselves are said to have constructed around their village as a fortification against the barbarians. They feed themselves by farming a hill on the outskirts of the village, which rises above the wasteland. So to explain here, the land is polluted, described as polluted in the text here, because the Eretrians live near a bitumen well, a place where asphalt is collected and processed. So that's a detail that we get in Herodotus as well, and the authenticity, I think, of that detail is perhaps further supported by the fact that we do have bitumen processors or workers attested in the Persepolis fortification tablets. But this geographical description, I think, is pure invention, as is the idea that the Eretrians would have had to fortify themselves against attack by neighboring barbarians. These attacks, at least in my view, are invented so that Philostratus' hero Apollonius can perform a service to the Greeks, as the reader soon finds out in this passage here. So again, Philostratus, the narrator, is writing here. In what sense, he asks, did Apollonius help those of the Eretrians still living? The barbarians who live near the hill would come in the summer and plunder it when the Eretrians sowed their crops. So they had to grow hungry as they grew food for others. When Apollonius met with the king of Parthia, he had the hill set aside for their exclusive use. So this passage portrays the Eretrians as a population that is constantly under siege. First, they're forced to eke out a meager life on a tiny sliver of land surrounded quite literally by noxious waste. And second, they are routinely robbed and despoiled by the non-Greeks who surround their settlement. For over 500 years, the author imagines, the Eretrians have had an inimical relationship with Persia's indigenous population, one that was apparently as bad in Apollonius's own day as it was at the time of their deportation, 5 centuries earlier. These Greeks remain out of their element, permanently out of place, and sundered from their homes in Greece. Luckily, Apollonius, great sage that he is able to obtain some reprieve for the Eretrians when he has an audience with the Parthian king, whose name is Vardanes. Apollonius wins Vardanes' favor through his virtue and his prudent counsel, and the king is determined to shower him with gifts in order to thank him for his wise advice. But Apollonius will accept only one thing. He asks that Vardanes put a stop to the ravaging of the Eretrians' hill, which in his view they should be allowed to cultivate in safety without fear of losing their crops. The king's response to this request is a very clear illustration, I think, of the connection and the continuity that the Romans saw between the Achaemenid Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE and the Parthian Empire of their own time. So this is King Vardanes answering Apollonius' request. Until yesterday, he says to him, the Eretrians were my enemies and the enemies of my ancestors, since they once took up arms against us, and they've been neglected in order that their race might perish. But from now on, thanks to Apollonius' intervention, they'll be numbered among my friends, and they'll have a good man as a satrap who will set their land to rights. So here, Vardanes is claiming that the ancient kings of Achaemenid Persia were his ancestors. And he justifies his continued maltreatment of the Eretrians on the basis of their 5th century BCE rebellion against his supposed predecessors. Now, the question of whether the Parthian and Sasanian kings actually looked back and saw the kings of Achaemenid Persia as their predecessors is a very controversial topic in pre-Islamic Iranian history, and it's a thorny topic because we just don't have any contemporary indigenous Arsacid or Sasanian sources that really speak directly and clearly to the matter. On the Roman side, however, the picture is much clearer, thanks in part to passages like this one. The Romans were absolutely convinced that the Parthians were the heirs to the Achaemenids, and that both empires represented basically the same thing. A vast eastern realm whose wealth and decadence and barbarism presented a sharp contrast with Greece and later Rome in the west. The art of Philostratus' text is to focalize this grand narrative around the ancient deportation of a small and really, in the scheme of things, rather unimportant Greek city from the Aegean to the Persian imperial heartland. Despite the passage of many centuries, the Eretrians in southern Mesopotamia remain fish. They are essentially Greek, and as such belong to Persia no more in the 1st century CE than they did in the 5th century BCE. Meanwhile, the Persian kings have maintained an inveterate hatred for this small community, whose presence in their empire they have tolerated only in the hopes of seeing it perish. The Eretrians avoid this fate only through the miraculous intervention of Apollonius, a Greek savior coming from the Roman Empire to rescue, in a sense, his Greek brethren, if a few hundred years too late. If we go back to the contemporary indigenous evidence from the Achaemenid period, the story, unsurprisingly, looks rather different. In Achaemenid imperial media, the Greeks are represented not as arch rivals or inveterate enemies, but simply as one people among many who participate in the Persian imperial project. Perhaps the most potent expression of this ideology is found on the Apadana, a royal audience hall at Persepolis built by Darius I, the very same king who seems to have made the most extensive use of deportation, at least as far as the extant evidence allows us to say. So on one of these reliefs on this building, we see what scholars mostly, almost unanimously, take to be a procession of Greeks, based mostly on their clothing. There are 8 figures in total, and 7 of them carry tribute. So from right to left, the figures at the front carry unadorned bowls, perhaps metal ones. Behind them, 2 figures are carrying folded textiles. And behind them, there's a third item that's occasioned a lot of debate. We're not entirely sure what it is, but it may represent bundles of wool. These contributions might be indicative of metal and textile imports that were prized in Persia, and there is some evidence, not a lot, but some, for a wider trade in these commodities in the classical period. So these figures are coming to supplicate the king, but they don't appear violently subjugated. And you can compare, I think, the Parthians in chains on the Arch of Septimius Severus in Rome, contemporary with Philostratus himself, for a rather different way of displaying foreign populations in imperial art. More important than the Greeks themselves, though, perhaps, is the wider context of the relief. The Greeks aren't alone, but they're simply one of an array of subject peoples, all of whom offered Darius gifts that in some way represented their homelands. These include some populations quite close to the heart of the empire, Elamites, Babylonians, Medes, but also others who are more peripheral, for instance, Indians, Scythians from Central Asia, and perhaps Ethiopians as well. The cumulative effect of the structure, as Margaret Root in particular has described, was the creation of, and I quote, unity through diversity. In other words, Persia's imperial strength is reflected through the myriad nations who come to offer the king, Darius, who's on the right side of the slide here, gifts. The Greeks were not antithetical to this imperial order, they were part of it, as the representation of them on the Apadana shows. Now, I don't want to imply here that the Persian Empire was good or benevolent because it was diverse and tolerant. And to Root's illustrative phrase, unity through diversity, I would also add another one, diversity through coercion. One of the ways that diversity was achieved at Persepolis, as the case of the Eretrians, among others, shows, was precisely through deportation and forcible resettlement, usually in the wake of campaigns of conquest and imperial expansion. I do want to underline, however, that the Achaemenid order that emerges from Persian art and inscriptions is very, very different from the ideology that underpins Philostratus's text. Where Philostratus describes the Eretrians in Persia as fish out of water, the Achaemenids might have described their empire as a pond that's made more glorious by the profusion of different kinds of fish that lived within it. Philostratus' account of this deportation is thus part of a long tradition in Mediterranean literature, a tradition that configured Persia as a hostile Eastern world where Greeks and later Romans simply did not belong. This tradition began, I think, in the classical period, but Philostratus' Life of Apollonius is one work among many that shows how Romans, looking back on the 5th century BCE, saw the Greco-Persian Wars as a precedent for their own confrontation with the imperial powers of ancient Iran. In his narrative of the Eretrians' fate, Philostratus lays out what were, in his view, the inevitable consequences of resettling Greeks in this imperial counterworld. The Greeks suffer isolation, hardship, and lasting enmity with the indigenous population. I want to close here on a note of some contemporary resonance. The issue that Philostratus' narrative raises is a fraught one that I think echoes beyond the confines of the ancient world. Do people really not belong in a place if their ancestors had been forcibly relocated there through deportation or coercion or enslavement? That question remains a crucial one in a world grappling still with the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade, wholesale population transfer by colonial powers, and most recently, forced migration from the Middle East to Europe. Texts from the ancient world offer, I'm afraid, very few solutions here. But I do hope that Philostratus' Eretrian digression shows how the historiography of forcible relocation can shape understandings of the present even hundreds of years after the relocations themselves have taken place. All the more important, then, that historians take these narratives seriously as objects of study. Thank you.
I thought Jake's paper is very, very interesting. Is there, do you think, also an implicit contrast in the behavior of Apollonius with the story that Alexander massacred the Branchidae? Again, because he thought that they'd become non-Greek.
No, I think that's right on. And the Alexander tradition is another really important part of the Persian Wars tradition. I mean, there are different models you can get. The Greco-Persian Wars is one paradigm, I think, which is defensive in nature. And Alexander's campaign represents a more offensive way of dealing with Persia. And I think, as far as deportations go, Alexander historiography, namely the main Alexander historians, but also authors like Seneca and Lucan, who are reflecting on Alexander as a model. Alexander himself is sometimes called a deporter of Greeks because he begins the Hellenistic period and populates Iran with large Greek communities. But I think the Branchidae fits quite well into this because they go and live in Bactria of their own volition. And I think the idea that they are kind of traitors to Hellenism in some way, and therefore you have a justification for the wholesale massacre of them, I think that fits precisely into the tradition as well.
I think there may also, of course, be, depending on the date of the life of Apollonius, you also have the problem of a particularly detestable Roman emperor who thought he was Alexander.
Right.
In Caracalla. And obviously the life of Alexander seems to be in a Caracallan context. So it would be showing how the philosopher, I think, is adopting a preferable behavior.
Yes, and we know he had a close connection to the court, to the Severans. So yeah, no, absolutely.
I was wondering, to what extent is this Eretrian logos trustworthy? Because obviously it is by Philostratus. Yeah. And we have to always look at the Heroica. And the Heroicos is obviously about precisely the same idea. It is the reinvigoration of a quite insignificant Trojan hero, Prosilitaeus, as a revenant, who is then inflicting damage upon the Persians for past umbrage afflicted in Asia. So obviously by the Persians upon the Greek temple of, I think it was Apollo, but I've forgotten the details. But anyhow, he's a revenant that is actually entirely resuscitated by Philostratus, and also in the context of a Severan war looming, between the so-called Parthians and the Romans. So to what extent is this another device in order to prepare the grounds for an acceptable Severan attack upon the Parthians, yet showing another example of a case where the Persians have perpetrated crimes that requires to be rectified? Because can you read Philostratus outside without comparing really Philostratus's Heroicos and the role of Prosilitaeus? That was one question, but if I have time, I do another one for some.
Thank you for it. In terms of its historical reliability is minimal, I think. There's been a lot of debate about his supposed source for this, the notebooks of Damas, who is perhaps the traveling companion of Apollonius. Perhaps, I mean, we won't ever know, but it seems quite likely, possible and maybe even likely, that the notebooks are invented, the source is invented, this is purely a rhetorical device, and he doesn't have any particularly good information about it. That's okay from my point of view, because I'm interested in the Roman appropriation of this tradition, so its historicity is of secondary importance. Some of the details I think are plausible, but that's a separate matter. In terms of the political utility of the narrative, the debate, as Professor Potter mentioned, is a problem. We don't have a super firm date for the life of Apollonius. But if it's 220, let's say, I think one issue that is problematic and is ongoing is the Severan dynasty launches a very serious attempt to not only conquer but also annex and incorporate Mesopotamia into Rome's imperial machinery. So if the boundaries had been, in the Severan period, where they are in the first century CE setting of the text, then this Greek population would have been within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. So that's a political detail, I think, that is not without some importance and resonance for Philostratus' readers.